Migration from the country to the city was undoubtedly impactful. In Wales across the 18th and 19th centuries, industrial settlements experienced huge growth from migrants leaving rural regions. This migration is often understood as motivated by economic factors. Rural people believed that new opportunities existed in the city, so they left their homes to pursue them. But I think that we do a disservice to our ancestors' stories when we only think of them as economic units that make rational choices related only to their finances. Because they, like us, are more complex than that. There are many interconnected reasons that people leave their home to look for different opportunities elsewhere. And while it might be difficult to always pinpoint why our ancestors traveled, we can always get clues by looking at the wider community and culture that made that travel possible. And today we're going to look at a story of how a group of my ancestors, across 150 years, traveled the 125 kilometers back and forth from Cardiganshire in Wales to Herefordshire in England. My name is Dai Davies of GenealCymru, and the first ancestor that I've found to have left Wales for Herefordshire was Elizabeth Thomas of Lampeter, also known as Old Mother Thomas. She moved to Herefordshire following her marriage to the Baptist minister, Reverend Joshua Thomas. Joshua had grown up in the nearby parish of Conwilcaio, and his family were some of the earliest Baptists in their community. Joshua left for Herefordshire around 1738 to preach to a congregation there, but returned to Wales and married Elizabeth. They then left for Leominster in Herefordshire, where they lived for the rest of their lives, and like many other nonconformist ministers, Joshua also opened a school. Joshua wasn't the first of his family to travel to Herefordshire. His paternal uncle, Simon Thomas, left Cardiganshire for Hereford at least by 1711. He too was a minister, a silk merchant, and an author of at least 5 books and pamphlets. But beyond that, he's a bit of a mystery. But Joshua would have known he followed in his uncle's footsteps as he traveled to Herefordshire himself. Beyond just the precedent in his own family, there were wider community links between the two places. Traditionally, farm laborers traveled from Cardiganshire to Herefordshire, where the harvest happened much earlier than at home due to the different climate. These two counties were also connected by the drovers' roads. There were direct routes between Tregaron, a centre of cattle droving in Cardiganshire, and places like Hereford, Leominster, and Withington in Herefordshire, which were stops on the drovers' travels as they made their way toward the east of England. So the infrastructure, for what it was in the 18th and 19th centuries, already existed to facilitate this travel, and these places were already familiar to families living in West Wales. When I'm researching migration, I like to think about the connections between places as possibilities. It's not really realistic to think that travel to any place seems possible or even desirable just because it's close or easy to get to. But our ancestors did grow up seeing other members of their family and people in their wider community leave home and settle elsewhere, and return with stories of those distant places. And those stories over time build up around these places, and they crystallize into these possibilities that are likely to be pursued by our ancestors. More relatives followed Joshua and Elizabeth to Herefordshire to attend the new school. Sometime in the 1750s, they sent for Elizabeth's nephew, David Davies, who went to live with them for a short time. There he got his education and learned English, but he returned soon after to Wales to attend other schools, and in Cardiganshire he settled and lived for the rest of his life. David's story is interesting because of how he added to the complexity of this travel between the two counties. After he completed his studies, he founded a school at Castell Hywel in Llandyssil, where the closest village consisted of no more than a handful of buildings. Castell Hywel School, in this very rural, out-of-the-way community, went on to be one of the most significant educational institutions in early 19th century Wales, drawing many of the young men who otherwise might have been sent to Herefordshire. But David Davies wasn't the last of his family to travel to England. 3 of his nephews were the next I know of who went to Herefordshire. Reverend Rhys Davis was the first minister of Whitestone Baptist Chapel in Withington. He got his post there through the Baptist Home Mission Society. His brother Benjamin was baptized at Whitestone Chapel in 1825 and went on to be a lay preacher. Their other brother, Reverend Joseph Davis, arrived in 1827 to become the next minister of Whitestone Chapel. Joseph also started a school there, which further entrenched this tradition of traveling from Cardiganshire to Herefordshire. Joseph lived the rest of his life at Withington, but his brother Benjamin returned home to Wales, and their brother Rhys went off to Ohio in the States. The next generation saw their nephew, David Jenkins, and his friend go off to Whitestone for their education in 1847. By the 1800s, there were 3 main schools that drew students from Cardiganshire. Boys were sent to either Whitestone Chapel, Kington, or Hereford, and the girls were sent to Kington, which had a mixed-gender school. As of 1945, the last 3 living members of this extended family to travel from Cardiganshire to Herefordshire for their education were 3 cousins who represent each of the 3 schools. Jemima Jones went to Kington, Reverend Joseph J. Davis went to Hereford, and Dan Jenkins went to the school at Whitestone Chapel. All 3 of them returned to Cardiganshire after their studies. The thing about back and forth travel like this is that it can be really tricky to see in the records that we have available. These young people only would have lived in Herefordshire for a year or 2, so the chances are slim of it showing up in the census. Dan Jenkins is actually the only one of them that I've found in Herefordshire for the census. In 1871, he was living at Whitestone Chapel with the Reverend Muriel Blaze and his family, and the 1871 census is the only census to show a student of the chapel, Welsh or otherwise. The typical go-to records for family history, the births, marriages, deaths, and census records, aren't really that helpful. Many of the particulars of this family's connection to Herefordshire in the 19th century only survives because Dan Jenkins preserved it in a 1945 newspaper article. It's those records that preserve the history of everyday life, like you sometimes get in the newspapers, or even more frequently in letters or diaries, where the details of this kind of migration survives. The late 1800s marked the decline of travel to Herefordshire for educational reasons. Changes to the provision of education came with the Education Act of 1870, the establishment of school boards, compulsory elementary education, and the opening of new schools in Wales really impacted how these Cardiganshire farmers educated their children and put constraints on the possibilities of travel available to them. But I think the fact that they continued travel to Herefordshire for school for as long as they did into the 19th century really highlights that idea of possibility. They didn't have to go to Herefordshire. They had a close relative with a highly successful school that was much closer to them geographically up until the 1820s. And there were many other schools in that part of Wales that were easier to get to that they could have attended instead. But I think that their continued connection to Herefordshire speaks to that accumulation of stories about elder family members going to that place. It probably also spoke to the kind of people they wanted to be and how they wanted to be viewed in their community. Traveling in this way for their education would have distinguished them from other members of their community and even of their own social class. Maybe that garnered them some prestige. Maybe it was a way of deepening their connection to the Baptist community, so maybe it was a religious experience. Maybe it was the particular kind of English language education that they received in Herefordshire that garnered them privilege in the community. Or maybe after all of these generations, Herefordshire seemed so close in the sense that going there was just something that you do as you come into young adulthood. I think there's a couple important lessons here. Remember that the most prominent trends in migration, like from country to the city, aren't the only trends that we'll find in our family tree. When you see your ancestors leaving one place for another, it's important to ask if they're the first in their family or in their community to take that path. Also, it's important to ask what you might be missing out on by only using what we think of as the typical genealogy records. And start to look for complexity in why your ancestors made the decisions that they did.